We almost always think of youth movements as being defined by protests, picket lines, and just really loud political demands. But what happens when an entire generation faces a massive economic crisis, and instead of taking to the streets with megaphones, they take to abandoned warehouses with synthesizers? Today, we're diving into this explainer to unpack a sociological mystery that completely redefines 1990s youth culture. We'll be looking at a brilliant 1998 academic dissertation by Dr. Eric Meyer, which examines the German techno scene, not just as some underground music genre, but as a profoundly organized social phenomenon.
And what's really wild about this slide is how an academic dissertation on techno opens with a provocative quote from Karl Marx: "One must force these petrified conditions to dance by singing them their own melody." Think about it. We usually associate Marx with rigid political theory, right? But here, Meyer uses him to frame a culture known for relentless pounding beats and neon lights. This quote perfectly sets the stage for us, because it hints that maybe, just maybe, all that dancing wasn't just an escape. Maybe it was a completely new form of societal engagement.
Which brings us to the core puzzle of our explainer. In the late 1990s in Germany, there was a really severe crisis in the job market, especially hitting young people hard. Traditionally, sociologists would expect to see a huge surge in youth joining unions, protesting, or participating in political parties to demand change. But that didn't happen. The youth seemed totally politically apathetic. The traditional avenues of political expression were practically a ghost town.
We call this section Das Paradox der Jugend, or the youth paradox. This massive contradiction was sharply highlighted in the 12th Shell Youth Study, which came out in May 1997. The whole goal of the study was to analyze the motives and forms of social and political engagement among young people during this incredibly precarious time. And honestly, the results they found left sociologists and political scientists absolutely baffled.
Because look at this stat. It is baffling. Only 1% to 2% of youth were participating in traditional political parties or unions at the time. Even participation in social reform and protest movements like environmental or human rights groups hovered way down below 5%. So, to the traditional academic observer, it literally looked like an entire generation had just thrown their hands up and completely given up on shaping their society. The absolute despair of the academic establishment is perfectly captured here by political scientist Peter Grotjan. Back in 1995, he lamented that never in the last 25 years had a youth generation been so silently and shamelessly betrayed in their personal and professional perspectives, and never had they accepted it so quietly. The older generation looked at these kids and saw nothing but total apathy. But we have to ask, were they actually silent? Because sitting right back to back with that tiny 1% participation rate in traditional politics, we see this staggering number, 1 million. That's the number of attendees at the 1997 and 1998 Love Parades in Berlin. 1 million young people gathering, organizing, and literally taking over the streets of the capital. So clearly, this generation wasn't incapable of mobilization. They just weren't interested in mobilizing the way their parents did. To solve this paradox, why a million kids would march for a beat, but not a ballot, let's move to our next section, die Theorie der Individualisierung. Dr. Meyer draws on sociological theories of the time, specifically those of scholars like Beck and Schulze, to explain this. So the crucial point here is that the youth weren't apathetic at all. They were undergoing what sociologists call individualization. Because traditional life paths, standard careers, lifelong institutional loyalties, were breaking down. Young people were naturally released from those traditional institutions. They completely rejected the strict behavioral norms of formal organizations. Instead, they started forming new social bonds based on the aesthetic design of their private lives and these shared temporary experiences. And this slide perfectly contrasts the old world with the new. Instead of traditional aggregation, meaning rigid norms, formal commitments, and paying your dues to a political party, youth shifted to post-traditional aggregation. They wanted voluntary participation, a focus on the aesthetics of everyday life, and temporary scenes. The youth of the 90s absolutely did not want to sign a membership card and sit through a boring committee meeting. They wanted groups that offered fun, diversion, and just uncomplicated interaction with like-minded people, without all those heavy long-term obligations. This naturally leads us into techno as soziales Phänomen, understanding techno not as a sound, but as a society. It was the ultimate prototype of this new, post-traditional way of gathering. It definitely wasn't just a playlist you put on in the background.
It was a comprehensive social framework. Which brings us to Dr. Eric Meyer's 1998 dissertation, The Techno Scene. He really elevated the techno scene to a serious academic subject here. He recognized that these massive commercial events and the collective reception of the music were actually the foundation of a highly complex, informal community.
Meyer describes the scene using this fantastic sociological term, a sub-Sinnwelt, or a sub-meaning world. It's a multi-dimensional semantic domain. What that basically means is that techno had its own language, its own visual codes, its own fashion, and its very own rules of interaction. It was an informal group formation where simply listening to the music collectively at a rave created a profound sense of belonging, while at the exact same time acting as a rejection of standard socialization norms. Think of it kind of like modern internet communities today. They have their own memes and slang, right? But back in the 90s, this entire subworld was built physically on the dance floor. But how do you actually study an invisible, fluid culture? I mean, you can't exactly walk onto a dark, incredibly loud dance floor at 3 a.m. with a clipboard and a survey. That brings us to Erforschung einer neuen Kultur, researching a new culture. Meyer had to figure out a completely unique methodology to decode this sub-meaning world. Instead of the old methods of outsider voyeurism, where academics keep this sterile distance and conduct rigid interviews, Meyer adopted the role of the professional stranger, or as it's known in German, the Grenzgänger, a cultural border crosser. He literally immersed himself in the raves. Just imagine a sociologist swapping out his tweed jacket for a pair of glow sticks. By positioning himself directly between observation and participation, he allowed his academic background to collide directly with the subjective reality of the ravers. And you can see this grounded methodology right from his table of contents. He didn't just look at the people. He analyzed the cultural artifacts they left behind. Entire chapters are dedicated to treating the ephemera of the club scene with the exact same academic rigor you might apply to a historical archive. He proved this was a highly organized subculture by analyzing its vast media ecosystem. He looked at flyers, which were so much more than just ads. They were vital visual event communication that signaled the aesthetic values of a specific party. He analyzed fanzines and free magazines, which is where the internal discourse and debates of the scene actually happened. And, incredibly remarkably for 1998, he even studied computer-mediated communication, like early internet webzines and event sites. This proved the youth weren't disorganized at all. They were actually light years ahead of their time, building a completely alternative functioning infrastructure. So, let's see how all of this builds to the ultimate manifestation of the era, Die Love Parade. What started way back in 1989 as a small demonstration of a few hundred people had, by the late 90s, become the undeniable center of gravity for German youth culture. The cultural power of this movement became so immense that the traditional political establishment just couldn't ignore it anymore. Even Gerhard Schroeder, who would go on to become the Chancellor of Germany, explicitly aligned his political identity with the Love Parade. He called Berlin a cheerful and exciting city known to young people through traditions like the Love Parade, basically saying that his vision of a new center republic wanted to tie directly into these exact cultural touchstones. The traditional establishment was literally trying to catch the rhythm of the youth. So, putting it all together, we see the complete narrative arc here. The youth of the 90s faced a severe economic crisis, but instead of joining the traditional institutions that they felt had betrayed them, they completely rejected those strict norms. Instead, they mobilized millions of people strictly on their own terms, relying on voluntary, aesthetic, and temporary bonds. They built a massive, functioning sub-society that operated completely under the radar of traditional metrics. Which leaves us with this final thought for the explainer. When we look back at the 90s techno scene through Dr. Meyer's lens, we have to ask ourselves, did this generation actually abandon society? Or did they, just as Karl Marx suggested at the very beginning, figure out how to make those petrified conditions dance to a completely new beat? It's a pretty powerful reminder that when people stop participating in traditional systems, it definitely doesn't mean they've stopped organizing. You just might have to look for them on the dance floor instead of the town hall. Thanks for diving into this slice of cultural history with me, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.